before we start, I'm going to thank my absolutely wonderful QA research fellows who are managing the complex technology. I have already prepared them that I'm probably going to go off-piste, but they've put a lot of effort into this, and it's very helpful to me as well. You know, over the course of the past 9-10 weeks, we've had the privilege of sitting through a series of, I think, extremely fascinating discussions led by members of our faculty and our academic community on areas of their expertise, their research, and their specialization through the lens of looking back at the world in 1919, when the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University was established in Washington. And one of the things that I have been particularly impressed by is the ability of our previous speakers to manage topics which were both very broad in scope and geography, and yet within an hour be able to leave us with a really sort of set of focused ideas to walk away with. And I have to say that when I started, you know, I picked this topic and I thought, oh my God, I'm ridiculous afterwards, because obviously it's a very broad topic. Migration and movement 100 years ago was happening in all parts of the world, and with in all sorts of forms. So what you're going to get from me today is a sort of disparate set of interconnected discussions on areas that I'm interested in. I have tried to look back to 1919 through a lens of what remains salient in contemporary discussions and ideas we have on migration and mobility. And I do think, from that perspective, 1919 and what the World War I and its culmination offer a very interesting perspective. I am not a historian, so you're not going to get from me a historian's historical account of any of these things, but I hope you'll still find something here that's relevant and interesting to you. So what are we going to do? I am going to begin with a brief discussion on what was happening in Europe immediately before and after the war in terms of mobility, of human movement. We can't escape it. It was huge. The levels of displacement that occurred during World War I on the European continent were, well, you all know, they were of an incredible scale. I am going to focus a few moments on talking specifically about Germany in the aftermath of the war, because I think it, again, provides for a very interesting setting in which to sort of think through some of the rhetoric and discourse around refugees, which, again, are relevant today. And I am going to spend a couple of seconds only, because Professor Kola is in the room, talking about the revitalization of the passport. For those of you who don't know, this it's an incredibly fascinating study and part of one of his core areas of research. And I hope about a year from now, he will give us an entire lecture on the evolution and the history of the passport. And then, because as I said, as you know, migration was happening all over the world in multiple forms, and there were many dynamics to it, I will move us right out of Europe to Southeast Asia to look at forms of labor migration that were occurring under the British colonial administration in what was referred to then as the Straits Settlements and Malaya, but what basically makes up most of modern-day Malaysia and also includes Singapore. And then I am going to just briefly talk about the ILO. And the reason that I do think it's important is, as this year, 2019, marks the centennial of the School of Foreign Service in Washington, it also marks the centennial for the ILO, which was established on the 29th of October, 1919. Then hopefully we'll wrap it up. If it might be 6 p.m. by then, but we'll see. We'll try not to. So we begin with Europe. We begin with Europe during the war. Now, I think we all know that what happened during the First World War changed society, changed history, changed everything at multiple levels in Europe. And of course, it had a deep impact on people's mobility and movement. Data is difficult. Figures are, hard to come by conclusively. What we know of is, at the bare minimum, at least 10 million people around Europe, and that's probably quite a conservative estimate, were impacted as a result of the war in terms of their mobility and in terms of their sort of migration status. Some official figures that Russia has say that within what comprised, let's say, Tsarist Russia at the start of the war, there was something close like almost 5 million who lived on Russian territory who were displaced. The reason for this displacement of people during the First World War, of course, some of them are quite obvious. There were many different fronts of warfare. There were many different areas of battlefield. Civilian populations residing in those areas were obviously displaced. Nobody wants to be sitting there in the middle of active violence and warfare. In some cases, they were evacuated out by military forces when areas were being occupied. I mean, there's so many examples of this. We do not have the opportunity right now to discuss this in detail. You could really do separate full case studies on different parts of the European continent. I mean, just as an example, early on in the war, when Germany invaded Belgium, we suddenly ended up with about 400,000 Belgians who were immediately displaced into Holland and on into France. As northern France was again occupied, French citizens obviously tried to enter into other parts of the interior of France. This occurred Serbia, when the Habsburg Empire invaded Serbia. We had hundreds of thousands of Serbs who were displaced. So the actual acts of war, occupation of territory, of your territory by an enemy state, resulted in lots of people being moved out, and that occurred throughout the entire theater of war that was occurring. The other element that led to a lot of displacement was that which states actually, state is a loose word, we're talking about empire, let's say political authority in whatever shape or form. The different warring sides engaged in actively displacing their own populations as well. As occurs in times of crisis and war, many of the political authorities that were involved in this war had complicated relationships with populations, their own internal populations, subcomponents of their demography. So they actively removed portions of their population who they thought were potentially disloyal, would engage with the enemy, would provide a conduit to enhance the capacity of an enemy state to make incursions into a territory. So particularly from border areas of some of these empires, populations were forcibly removed. And this was equally traumatic. Even if you weren't being forced over an international border to seek refuge in a neighboring state, you were being forced by your own sort of government to relocate to a completely different part. And there were many offenders. We cannot say that only the Central Powers did this and the Allied didn't. This happened on both sides of the equation. Russia did it, the Ottomans did it, the Austrians did it. So. But this also was extremely caused a lot of problems for people's mobility. Wars do weird things to mobility and movement of human beings. We can't even walk away with a clear statement that what it does is forcibly move people, or you just end up with displaced populations. Wars also basically they intrude on the capacity of people to, I think, assert their own rights around their mobility choices. So voluntary forms of mobility, which had existed in Europe prior to the war, for example, moving to another country to study, or you are visiting family, or the kinds of normal movements that people engaged in for personal as well as economic reasons, which actually happened all over the European continent. We have circular patterns of economic labor migration that occurred. You had seasonal labor between Italy and some of its neighbors. These patterns of normal migration were also disrupted because in the context of war, borders which had been more fluid, more porous, not as securitized or scrutinized, became much more sort of closely guarded and managed by the different states at war. After the war, again, I'm trying to make this very short, Professor Kolar discussed this in his first lecture when we started these series of talks. The European landscape at the end of the war had changed dramatically and drastically, which also had great implications for people's movement and mobility. Populations, for example, that had been displaced as a result of being present in an active theater of war, but who had probably presumed they would return. I mean, they would leave the place they were temporarily hosted in and found that places that they had been in before were no longer the same places. I mean, if you had lived in Tsarist Russia, for example, and you were temporarily somewhere else as a refugee, and then suddenly you're looking at Central Europe and these new Balkan states, and you're wondering where exactly you're meant to go. So this had implications for the the population that had been made into refugees as a result of the war. It also had huge implications for people who woke up they had not moved, but they were actually in a completely new state, which perhaps one where their nationality, linguistic, national affiliation, belonging didn't align. So this again resulted in all forms of movement and mobility. What we also cannot escape is, in addition to just World War I, are the consequences of the two Russian revolutions in 1917 and then the civil war in Russia. This added an entire new dimension in terms of mobility and displacement in the immediate aftermath of the war. So now moving to a little discussion of Germany. I think Germany makes for a really interesting case if we look at what was happening there in 1919. It was obviously on the losing side of the war, but until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June, its final territorial, what was going to become its coherent territorial sort of mass hadn't fully been decided. Its borders were not fully decided. But yet what is very interesting is over the course of 1919, Germany saw itself receiving large numbers of displaced populations. And there's something almost counterintuitive in it. Why would people choose to go to Germany in 1919? It seems illogical that you're going to make the effort to go to a country which has lost massively, lost territory, lost obviously economically and socially. It's not particularly stable. The nascent Weimar Republic is a few months old in 1919. So why would Germany suddenly see itself, I don't want to use the words that were used, but let's say flooded, because that's what was used. The numbers, again, we do not have. We do not have a proper sense of how many people actually entered Germany over the course of 1919. But the numbers were high. And it was a diverse group of displaced people who ended up in Germany that year. But there are two large groups I'm going to focus my comments on, and not all the others. One group makes some sense, right? These are ethnic Germans who had previously, before the war, been dispersed all around different territories of what was the German Empire, but then subsequently was turned into these different Central European states and Eastern European states. So ethnic Germans, speaking German, possibly felt at the conclusion of the war that their status and situation in these new countries, these nascent countries they were in, was not going to be a positive one. So these were not all voluntary, but they were technically seeking to return to the German heartland, right? They often came to the eastern border. Prussia and that side of the country was what was mostly being accessed. And they often didn't have they had no documentation, they had no passports, they had baptismal records or some letter from some municipal authority or something. But that was one big group of people that was entering Germany in 1919. And the second big group were the Russians. Numbers, again, are vague, but possibly as high as 1 million, certainly more around 400, 500, 600,000 Russians did enter Germany through its eastern border over the course of the year. Why I bring this up and why I'm interested in discussing this a little is what actually happened domestically in Germany during the course of the coming of all these displaced populations. Quite quickly, the sort of rhetoric, the public rhetoric, so, political leaders who perhaps were on the opposite side of the Social Democrats alliance, which was sitting in Weimar, or concerned citizens, whatever it was, there was a lot of public agitation expressed around these hordes of invading aliens coming in, and who are these people, and what are the implications for us. We have, Germany, we're already dealing with a lot of instability. We have, they were in the process of coping with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, dealing with the long-term economic hardships that would technically, obviously be imposed upon them in terms of war reparations. So there was displaced populations that entered Germany became a focus point of anxiety for the public. As is remarkably resonant today and has happened repeatedly in history, this population really served more as a kind of political and social emblem of what other challenges and what other insecurities were happening for the German population at the end. The government, their response at that time, and it's understandable. This was a nascent government that was struggling to assert its own legitimacy and develop a proper, stable response to the conclusion of the war and to the Treaty of Versailles and all that. But their response, rather than, I think, perhaps try to diffuse or diminish the public discourse and rhetoric that was emerging around the refugee crisis and the problem of these refugees, the government's response was actually to actually say we are taking this with great seriousness, and this is a real problem, and we must secure our border, and we must investigate who these people are coming in, and we will reinforce the border, and we will strengthen our border patrols, and we will create systems of ensuring that these displaced populations don't descend upon our cities and do not start overtaking resources which we need to set aside for our own population. So the government's response was actually, it sort of reinforced the fact that this was a terrible crisis, this was going to overwhelm Germany, and it was going to be a huge problem. And so the various measures that the government, that the Weimar Republic sort of focused on were things like border control and enhancing, securing the border, creating some kind of system of encampment or keeping refugees at bay from the main cities, trying to authenticate who these people were. There was even discussion of starting some kind of national registry to register displaced populations. And of course, actually, none of these things happened because the state lacked the capacity to be able to do much at all. Securing the Prussian border, the eastern border, me on this. I mean, what I've heard, 9,000 kilometers and possibly 900 military personnel were deployed to guard it. The state did not have the capacity, regardless of what its intent or wishes were. It had just gone through a brutal war. It was struggling to develop state capacity at multiple levels, and securing the border, frankly, until July, August, they didn't even know what the border was. So that was pretty much a pipe dream. Trying to, create camps or ways of reducing the load on cities, that also they were not effectively able to do at all. I think by the middle of 1919, there was something like 350,000 Russians apparently in Berlin. But so again, the fact is, the situation sort of dealt with itself. Over the next 3 or 4 years, well, first of all, within the next 24 months, I would say the flow of refugees, but 1919 saw the height of it, the numbers decreased drastically after that. Many of the Russians the Russian cohorts who came into Germany during 1919 fell into different groups. Of course, there were class and economic differences between them, but there were the group of Russians who really had come from parts of Poland, and who had come and were really waiting things out until Russia itself stabilized. And so their intention was probably to return, which many of them did. They returned once the Soviet Union had sort of asserted itself and established stable control. Many of those moved back. The other cohort of Russians who would have been, the supporters of the anti-Bolshevik side of the Civil War, they were not going to be going back anyway. Because the situation in Germany also economically difficult in subsequent years, many of them chose to move elsewhere and leave Germany. So the actual crisis in Germany of refugees flooding in stopped on its own because of other dynamics and not because anything the state had done. What the state had done is engage with its public in a very sort of deliberate and, ethnic-oriented toxic debate and language around the refugee crisis, which had, I think, lingering impacts on Germany as a whole. Again, estimates say that perhaps only around 10% of the Russian immigrant population that came in at this time was Jewish. However, in the rhetoric and articulation used around this, it was meant to be like 90% of people coming in. So that was really the point that I wanted to make on this, is that, the rhetoric that was established and which the Weimar Republic did not successfully try to diffuse, I think had long-term implications for Germany as a whole. So I will, as I said, spend about 2 seconds talking about the passport. The reason I think 1919 and the war is really interesting when it comes to the passport, sorry, I'm going to check how I'm doing, if I've hit my 3-hour mark yet or not. The passports have been around, obviously, for a long time, definitely predating the 19th and 20th century. But over the course of the 19th century, at least in Europe, they had, from what I understand, they had largely fallen into disuse for a variety of reasons. Not because everybody, all the states were just benign and happy and loved to have people coming. A lot of it, frankly, was also about their ability to vet people, especially as mass transit options increased vastly over the European continent. It became too difficult to even really know who was coming and going. But for other reasons as well, passports were really not in fashion. You did not necessarily need to have a formal passport to cross an international border. We're sitting here right now, and I think we all find it absolutely impossible to imagine. There was a time when passports not only were not used or needed, but there was a time when there was an active debate around whether passports were a good thing. We take it as granted. I mean, you don't really exist without your passport. You can only leave your country with one. You can access another only if you have one. But this wasn't always the case. There were debates around this because the passport did symbolize for people a curtailment of what they was conceived of and was debated as a human right to mobility. And then who should have the authority to determine it? We also take it as a right that states are the only sort of form of political authority that has the right to determine your access to your mobility rights. This also it's a fairly recent historical phenomena. Your mobility rights a couple of 100 years ago might have been determined more by the landlord whose fields you were tilling, or, your employer, or, other forms of entity. But during the course of the war, passports were revitalized, again, as a result of this, the greater securitization. Countries in the midst of war look closely at their own populations. They want to know who they can trust, who they can rely on, who is a fifth columnist, who potentially you're not really sure of, might have dual loyalty, might actually do something for the enemy state on their behalf. So in general, all these different states and empires were looking far more closely at their own people. They were looking far more closely at who was coming and going over their borders. And around 1914 or 15, France reintroduced the necessity of a passport for all of its citizens traveling overseas, and as well as for those coming in. And most of the other states did this as well. And I think what makes it really interesting is at the conclusion of the war, there were these active discussions that, I love all these pictures I want to take a photograph like this for my passport, but I'm sure that Professor Kola has a huge supply of these photographs, but I spent ages looking at some which I loved. But basically, during the League of Nations meeting, at the conclusion of the war, it was actively proposed that there needed to be some kind of standardization of passports across states. standardization of the kind of information one needed to put on it, how to authenticate people's identity. And there were several sort of conferences and all held around how to manage this whole idea of passports. There was opposition. There were a lot of people, political leaders and whatever, citizens, civil society groups who said this is ridiculous. We only needed passports because we were at war. Now we are going to go back to non-wartime conditions. Why should we have passports? But the people who won out were, of course, those who thought, no, we needed passports. And some of the articulation around this was because of the rise or the establishment of the USSR, and this understanding that the world had irrevocably changed, that Europe would never go back to what it was before. And so it would be too utopian to consider the idea of a world where passports weren't needed. Anything you build, it's easier to build than deconstruct. And so we live now in a world where the passports have evolved steadily since. But yeah, in 1919 and 1920 were the first, when there was this momentum to establish the kind of standardized passports that we have today. And so now I am going to move, not bad, I mean, I did that in like half an hour, so you can't complain. Now I'm going to move to, as I said, a completely different part of the world, which also matters, it's not just Europe, but anyway. And the reason I'm talking about this, which is completely disconnected to ideas of refugees and displacement, is because, as some of you might know, I'm really interested in economic and labor migration. I'm interested in current forms and contemporary forms of them. And what I find very interesting is that these have evolved from systems that have existed and been with us for ages. There's very little in the current moment that is hugely different to what has existed, and that's probably because human beings are always the same. So this case study that I'm going to briefly talk to you about looks at labor migration under the British colonial administration into Southeast Asia or Malaya, as it was called then. The British, this is one case of multiple. I mean, you could be speaking of something similar in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, and parts of Africa and elsewhere. The British in Malaya, during the course of the 19th century, were rapidly building up different productive commodity sectors. A lot of this was around the plantation economies of different agricultural products, sugar, rubber, of course. And they were also investing actively in developing extractive sectors. And in Malaysia, a lot of this was around mining, particularly tin mining. The production of these commodities was integral and critical to the development of British industrialization taking place back home. Now, in Southeast Asia, what the British dealt with when they, in terms of developing these economies as they needed to, was the challenge of a small local population for labor, and a small local population with the skills needed. In addition to developing the plantation and mining economies, the British were also doing what they did in other colonial, other parts of the empire, which were huge infrastructure projects. It was not all benign. These infrastructural projects were essential. If you needed to get your rubber to the port in Singapore, you needed trains, you needed roads to do so. So they also needed a lot of labor for these large infrastructural projects. 1833, slavery is abolished across the colonies, right? And I mean, the British looked to India as a place of surplus labor. It's massive population, can easily transport them around and use them for development in some of these colonial peripheral areas. The problem was with the abolishment of slavery is that, they wanted people to sign up and say, sure, I'm going to go to Trinidad and I'm happy to go to Singapore, but there were not a lot of people volunteering for this. So they introduced the indentured labor system. And under this system has existed at that point in many parts of the world. There's a whole history of indentured servitude in the US. I'm speaking specifically of the manifestations of this under the British colonial administration in Southeast Asia, because there are differences between how these things came about. The indentured labor recruitment system in Malaysia basically Again, the figures vary, but overall they say about 4 million Indians went under the indentured labor recruitment system to different parts of the empire, and possibly about 2 million went to parts of Southeast Asia. These were, so the British administration managed this using local bodies of sort of bureaucracy within India. But they technically were responsible for the entire system, from identification of potential laborers through recruitment, through arrival in Malaya, and through their work they began to do on these plantations. There were, of course, hundreds and thousands of intermediaries along the way who were part of this system. There were people, Malaya did not come directly under colonial rule, but it occupied a heavy protectorate status, and most of the economic development taking place in Malaya at that time was done so through the British sort of architecture around it. The indentured labor contracts basically tied individual voluntary, you signed on to this. The contracts were between 5 to 10 years. And they were tied to wages. It was technically a wage-based contract, but they were very low. Like 12 cents a month, something like that. The migrant workers who came carrying heavy debt, which was also then used as bondage for the period of indenture, because when they were transported, mostly from South India, mostly from what is parts of Tamil Nadu and further south these days, they came carrying the price of their transport. It was covered by their employers, it was covered by shipmasters, it was covered by labor recruiting agents, but ultimately it was the worker who had to pay this back. The period of indenture was meant to culminate at the end of 5 years if they no longer wanted to work, or 10 years, depending on how long they were forced to stay on that one contract. It bound them to a place of employment. It bound them to one employer. It bound them to living in accommodation provided for them at the lookout, on the plantation. Does this sound familiar? But anyway, so the fact is, this is what the system was. The main thing was not even about cheap labor. I don't even think it was just about the cost. It was about ensuring that people stayed and were made immobile and could not exercise free mobility. I'm going to compare this component of the Indian migrants who were arriving in Malaya at this time to work on the plantations with another system of indentured, also under indentured contracts, which were the Chinese who were coming in through parts of southern China. The Chinese cohort into Malaya also worked and came under these indentured contracts. But they were not directly administered. They did not enter into Malaya through the British colonial system. It was more of a sort of self-generated net. There was a large established network of Chinese entrepreneurs, business people involved in the mining industry. China, and particularly southern China, had a long history already in Malaya. They had a history of sending people there, starting their own businesses. They were working in the extractive industries anyway. The Chinese workers were brought in also in very large numbers to meet some of the labor demands that existed in Malaya at that point. But the system by which they came was different. They came through, I'm not saying it was pleasanter, it wasn't necessarily better. Their conditions would be as arduous, the work conditions were as difficult, they were not paid necessarily more. But there was a different status through which they were brought in. They were brought in through these large Chinese networks of including secret societies. I do not know much about these secret societies, but a lot of them was its own kind of Chinese organized system. The Chinese also worked on plantations, but the majority of them actually worked in the extractive sector, in the mining sectors. So there was also a sectoral differentiation, with the Indian workers more on plantation and agricultural work, the Chinese more in mining and those sectors. The Chinese also, on a daily basis, exercised far greater personal mobility. Though they also lived in group accommodation and were fairly tightly controlled through their employment arrangements, they had far greater access to going to nearby cities, to having time in which to develop other kind of social capital and networks. The Indians were recruited, they were kept on site, they worked on site, they were kept away from the city. The interesting thing about this is that it had a long-term historical significance for how Chinese migrant workers who stayed on in Malaysia were integrated into the labor economy and labor market later, as opposed to the Indians. Chinese who've completed their period of indenture managed to far more easily find possibilities for starting small jobs or starting, small businesses or getting alternate jobs. The Indians were far more incapacitated. And the linkage and the reason for that is really tied into how they were recruited. I'm going to speak a little about the Kangni recruitment system. Why did I speak about indentured labor in context of a class meant to focus on 1919 is because 1919 and 1920 is when the indentured labor system was finally abolished. Again, primarily because of the fact that there was a lot of international attention, and when I say international attention, I mean international attention from India and Indian citizens. The Indian nationalist movement took up the banner of the cause of these indentured workers who were their citizens and being sent abroad to work in abysmal conditions and treated really poorly and ending up, death rates, ill health, all those things are up there when it comes to this cohort of indentured workers. Gandhi took it up as one of his big causes. So as a result of that, in 1919, the indentured labor system was pretty much abolished across the colonies. However, with great foresight and anticipation, the colonial administrators and their partners in economic development in Malaysia, which meant a lot of these plantation owners, had already looked at other creative things that they could possibly do. How to ensure a workforce that would stay, that would not leave, and that would continue to work under a system where they were technically free to leave and go elsewhere and look for other work. So what slowly started replacing the indentured labor system in the Malaya plantations around the early 1900s was this Kangni recruitment system. Kangni, which I have been told is the correct pronunciation, stands for overseer. And basically, rather than turning to these labor recruiters that were organized through the British colonial administration and the labor recruitment that came through the ships, and rather than using the architecture of the British colonial administration in India to bring workers out, the Kangni system had plantation owners and employers devolve the system of recruitment down to the overseer or a bunch of different overseers on a plantation who were usually themselves South Indian. And they were basically encouraged to use their social networks, their family and kinship networks back home in their villages and communities to identify, recruit, and bring workers out. The overseer, the successful Kangni who brought workers, there was a profit inducement. He was given a sum of money every month for each one of the workers that he had recruited in and who had stayed and completed their months of work. So it created this sort of link between these particular overseers and the workers who were brought in. And while, of course, it was a big improvement on the indentured system, which was tied to these rigid contracts, it came with its own degrees of unpleasantness because the Kangni obviously used other forms of manipulating these relationships to ensure that people stayed even in circumstances they didn't want to. It's interesting because this is very similar to systems we see in place today in the Gulf and in other parts of the world as well. We actively see components of the recruitment system these days who actually are fellow nationals who are engaging in bringing in people. The Kangni did all the things that that administrators had been doing under the indentured work system, lying actively to potential laborers and migrants about the conditions of the work they would be engaged in, doing a lot of deceit in terms of explaining what working conditions and wages and all would be like, overemphasizing the benefits of completing your work there and being able to live and be given a huge mansion to live in and land afterwards and all kinds of rewards. So I think this is an interesting illustration because I see a lot of similarities between what was happening here more than 100 years ago and what I see today. I'm going to try and be really quick and brief because I know I have a 15-minute cutoff. I bring up the ILO. Well, first of all, 1919, it is the centennial of the mothership of my current employer, the School of Foreign Service. It is also the centennial of one of my first employers. I worked for the International Labour Organization in the mid to late 1990s. And they were established on October 29th, 1919, under the auspices of the League of Nations. And of course, the League of Nations didn't have a long history, but the ILO persisted and is still with us today. It was one of the first agencies of the UN as well. Why am I interested in the ILO? There are multiple reasons, but the reason I bring it up not only is because of the fact that it's its centennial, and I think it's significant to think why was it established 100 years ago, what was its purpose, what happened at the end of the war, or why was it suddenly significant? How does it tie into the broader landscape of Europe? Because we will say it, I will say it, I work for them, the ILO was a European and American project. It only started to look at the rest of the world, frankly, after about the 1950s. And a lot of its area of focus, its idea of standard setting, was set for Europe, the North Atlantic world. After the 1960s and 70s is when we actually see it taking some of its core areas of responsibility and discussing them in broader contexts. It did not engage in any of the colonial enterprises, let's put it that way. The ILO, so in the run-up to the war, in the teens, and then right after the war, around 1919 and 1918, labor politics, international labor politics, was surging. Right? There was a sense amongst a lot of workers and labor movements that they had tacitly agreed to support the Allies during the war, and that there was going to be a reward for this. They had demobilized their activities during the war. They had not been actively pressing for an improvement of labor rights, and they had put up with conditions. And then at the conclusion of the war, they wanted some of their concerns addressed and met. There was a spate of discussion which was very socialist in orientation. There were calls to completely end wage labor and turn to much more socialist markets and ideas around labor's role in the economy. And then you had the Russian Revolution. And I think for a lot of Western leadership around 1919, this was a huge cause of concern. They felt they needed an appropriate and responsible response to the Bolshevik Revolution to make sure that the communists didn't run away with the whole, sort of all legitimacy when it came to addressing workers' grievances and issues around workers. So the ILO really was established in the midst of that. They were even up to October, there were several conferences on what exactly the ILO, or what should be done, what could be the global mechanism by which states could cooperate on addressing the needs and rights of workers and wage workers. But there were very different opinions on what this should look like. And I think if we look at the ILO and its establishment, it was really a question of sort of balance and pragmatism that won. It has done a lot of good work, it had good intentions, but it was really partially introduced to diminish the sort of more extreme demands of the liberalizing the forces of labor. It had adopted a balanced approach of including employers. It has a tripartite construction, a tripartite mandate. It includes employers' views, workers' views, and of course the state. But again, for me, one of the things that is really interesting when it comes to this is it reinforced the state again as the sort of arbiter and adjudicator for potential disputes between workers and capital, employers and workers. And I think that's really interesting because the state is not disinterested. The state is not a disinterested party in any of these things. So placing it firmly right there as the main sort of guardian of both workers and labor's rights is an construct. So that is, I think I've done pretty well. I'm almost done. So I will end on just like a final little note, which I hope addresses, I mean, it's sort of, we can critique anybody wants to critique the ILO can come and see me and we'll talk about it for like hours. But yeah, I'm going to end with this, which is, it's drawn from other work, but I think it speaks really to my what I'm trying to say in many of these cases, which is, so political authority in whatever shape or form, be it a state and the state as we recognize it, but even before, has always had an interest in controlling people's movement, in knowing who's doing what, where they're going, how they're accessing our resources, and if not limiting it, certainly managing it. Over the course of the past 100 years, we have seen the main transition and change I think we've seen is that we're in an international system now where we recognize that states, modern states as we define them in the international system, are the only authority that really can control people's mobility, that states have the sovereign right to determine who goes where and when and how. And we have, around this idea, states have created the capacity to be able to do it. I mean, it's not that they were lovely and benign before. Political authority was never necessarily benign, but it didn't have the ability to do a lot of stuff about it, and now they do. They have the capacity, they have the bureaucracy, they have the technology to be really able to look at their own populations, to determine your authenticity from the day you're born until the day you die, that you are this person, and wherever you are in the world, the state can determine this is this person, and they have technically the right to be here or not to be here. And all of this, is guarded by the system of international norms that we don't even question and we take for granted. I know that the idea of individuals having the right to free mobility is something that most people find even hard to take on and think of it as being quite frightening and potentially destabilizing. Having said that, reinforced how important the state has become, I think it is also, when you work on any of these things in any deeper, nuanced fashion, you realize people have resisted it all along, and they continue to. The state might have grown its capacity in multiple ways, but it actually cannot control people's mobility fully. It cannot stop them from coming, it cannot stop them from staying. People have their own agency in determining how they navigate the various channels and opportunities open to them for asserting their rights to mobility. Claire and Brendan both fell asleep, I'm just saying. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I think we should just, okay, go ahead. Don't ask me anything complicated. No, I don't think so. Not really. From what I can understand, most of their actual indentured contracts were very similar, but sometimes depended on the nature of work. So, for example, some work associated with mining was paid a little more than some of the tasks associated with plantation work. So the differences were not necessarily ethnicity based as much, but it was more based on the kind of work and all.
So I visited South Africa recently, and there were a lot of what the people themselves they called they were previously Malay slaves, but then they now become citizens of South Africa. So what was the difference between them and the indentured contractors in the Malay area, the ones in South Africa?
Way outside my remit, but I will try. I mean, from what my understanding of the systems that existed in what was happening in Southeast Asia also was occurring very much in parts of Africa, but with slight modifications. I don't know specifically about the arrangements for the Malay slaves, honestly, but I know that the Natal in general and parts of South Africa was one of the most intense areas where a lot of these indentured systems were also in place. It was an interim measure between full slavery and then the sort of tied, unfree labor. But I do know that there are differences. I know that when it comes to Africa in general, the history and pattern of how forced and unfree labor was instituted is not exactly the same. Answer that fully.
So what about the colonies? When you talk about the passport, what about the people living in the colonies of, for example, the British and all? Could they possibly get a passport and then travel to other places, or was that just reserved to citizens?
Well, I mean, I think British subjects could. Please feel free, Professor Kola, to jump in. British subjects obviously did get passports in part in some of the colonies. They did travel. They went for pursuit of education. They were a bit different. I mean, they were not all the same passport. And of course, this depended a lot on. So the entire topic of mobility and migration within colonial spaces is a big one. But in terms of how you accessed a passport, it did really depend on your status also, right? So if you were like in the British bureaucracy, serving under the colonial administration, much easier. If you were some random landless peasant, I mean, you have to go jump through hoops, and I mean, highly unlikely. So it was very seriously vetted, from what I understand. I'm dying for the book, Ed. Seriously.
I think no one is dying for it more than me. I have a question, though, and it's not about passports. It's about the International Labour Organization. I mean, first of all, I thought the whole presentation was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. And we're going to talk afterwards. But no, my question is about the International Labour Organization and the turn you mentioned in the 1960s to work beyond Europe. What motivated that turn? Was it sort of mass decolonization and international organizations therefore having, member states that are, increasingly from those parts of the world? Was it a sort of a sense of our work is done in Europe and the North Atlantic, so let's move on? Was it a humanitarian impulse? Like, what was it? So
actually, that's really interesting. And I'll answer it to the best that I can, but it's something I'm really interested in looking at. So the ILO, from its early beginnings, was a combination, I think, of it wasn't so much about norm setting as it was about a lot of practical coordination. What happened in Europe in the run-up also in terms of bilateralism in terms of labor mobility within the European context. The ILO was an integral part of that in terms of sort of the agreement signed between Poland and France, for example, right? Which became something that was replicated in many other European contexts. This idea of bilaterally engaging with other states directly to recruit labor, to manage economic migration between. I think that was part of the impetus, because a lot of this then started being informally adopted in other areas. France adopted a very similar system with some of its North African colonies, kind of based on the bilateral agreement it signed with Poland. So I think there was also kind of natural drawing in for the ILO. I don't think it was just totally norm-based. I would love to say it kind of ran out of work to do in Europe, but I don't think that's just it. I think partly it was also the thing is of seeing that there were all these kind of informal arrangements happening between states, particularly the fact that the colonial system might have eroded, but these engagements were continuing, and that there was a need more for standardization and an intrusion of a kind of multilateral framework to manage some of this. I think that's part of it. I think the second thing is definitely the liberation of a lot of these areas which technically had been tacitly under European control, but kind of doing their own thing. That you were judged on what you did at home. You were judged on how you dealt with workers at home and how you dealt with these things on your own turf. But that was sort of left as a gray space. But once that was removed, then of course it was that, well, let's see what's happening in these areas and the same lens applied, holding sort of nation states responsible for those issues in turn. And possibly part of the larger sort of kind of international norm-setting streak that was taking place. This is in the immediate, post-war, in German context or in other parts of Europe. Again, based on what I know. So in terms of your first question, I think, which I didn't address because I didn't have time to in this, is that there was all this displacement and all these, refugees were created and statelessness produced and all. But the biggest, one of the biggest issues is nobody was prepared. Like the countries involved in the war had not anticipated or prepared for it. So like France was completely befuddled with what to do with these hundreds of thousands of, its own citizens suddenly moving in, or the Belgians coming in. And so a lot of the response, through the war at least, was ad hoc, chaotic, and depended very much on what was available at the local level. I think at a federal level, there would be, some sort of assistance, some sort of, a discussion or resources like diverted for the purpose. But a lot of it was done by charitable organizations that were there, church bodies. In some cases, it was left entirely up to the populations who had come in, the displaced people, to use their own resources to find shelter, and it was very non-coordinated and disorganized in the earlier stages, as far as I know. In terms of these administrative bodies, basically like what happened in the German context is they kind of told the municipal level authorities to manage a lot of the situation. And I think that's just because, again, at that stage in 1919, the central government did not have the capacity to go and do a bunch of stuff themselves. And the second question regarding like the kinds of travel documents that existed. So again, one of the interesting things in Tsarist Russia, as well as the Ottoman Republic, there was actually much more interest on part of the authorities to see what was happening within their border and where their people were moving around the border. That was considered more of a security issue and threat. They wanted to know which part of the empire their own people were moving to and what were they doing there. The travel documents, whether they existed, were not, I don't think, as much focused on the international dimension of travel, but they were on local, the local dimension. And interestingly, at least in the Ottoman case, their concern with people, issuing passports for international travel, it was not, they weren't as concerned about people coming in. They were more concerned about their citizens who were leaving, right? So they actually had bars on their citizens leaving, because the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges they were facing at that late stage of their, at the late stage of their empire, was the fact that they had so much external intrusion from these European powers. And their citizens who were moving, or not citizens, their subjects who were moving and getting, for example, alternate nationality. So if you had certain Christian communities that moved and got American nationality, and then could come back and be on the territory, but actually claim sovereign protection, right? So they were actually more interested in preventing communities leaving than coming. Thank you all, and thank you to Yasmin and Irene for their beautiful slides.